Today on Let's Talk Schools, we're going to be talking to Dr. Ryan Moore all about policy development and program evaluation. Hi, I'm Mike Looney, the Superintendent of Schools here in Fulton. Welcome to another edition of Let's Talk Schools. Today I have the policy expert for the district, Dr. Ryan Moore. Dr. Moore, you're the Executive Director of Policy and Strategy and Governance.
Yep.
So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr.
Tell us a little bit about what you do and how do you manage the policy whispering process in Fulton County Schools?
Policy whispering is a good way of putting it, Dr. Looney, but thank you for having me. So we actually revamped our entire board policy review process a few years ago. Policy was one of those things we used to bring to the board in the middle of the board meeting and try to submit either minor changes or major changes and really have a conversation at the dais with the board. We've revamped that process to spend more time with the board, unpacking our policies, getting an idea of where is their philosophical beliefs about different topics with policy. And then we spend a lot of time drafting, getting feedback from our constituents to revise our policy drafts and make sure they align with our current practices and best practices in research. So it's a very intensive process these days.
A lot of people don't really understand one of the major functions of the school board is policy development.
That's right.
That's how they govern the school district. I tell principals and employees all the time, there's probably a policy for that. And policy has the effect of a directive. This is how we're going to do business.
That's right.
And so we've slowed the process down. How large is your staff? And talk to us about from policy, ideas through the implementation or through the design and ratification process.
Yep, so right now I have a continuous improvement staff that's made up of 3 people. I have a coordinator and 2 analysts who work explicitly on policy with me. But the policy process is definitely elongated. I think slowing it down is the right way of putting it. So from ideas, we usually start to do benchmarking. So if we have an idea for a policy, we look at other districts, not just in the Atlanta metro area, but across the country. We start to look at other industries to see what policy practices are emerging, and we even look in research articles to see guidance on new policies. We present those to our board and really engage in our pre-work sessions, which we take place before our board meetings that are open to the public. It's a great opportunity to learn more about the policy world. But that process can really take 2 to 3 months just to break down all of that information. And then our policies actually go through a 2-month board cycle minimum so that our community can have even greater input into our policy drafts before they're ratified by the board.
Right. So that's really where the sausage making happens. It's really where the lively debates happen. It's in the policy development process because you're exchanging ideas against values and best practices. So it's a really, really interesting process. I'm really proud of the fact that we spend so much time and effort on making sure that our policies are well thought out. Sometimes, though, policies have unintended consequences.
That's right.
So once you pass a policy, you enact it, and then we learn that, you know what, it's not working quite as we intended to. Then how do we make changes?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Dr. Looney. We've run into some of those in the last couple of months. You know, and I have to give a shout out to our schools. They're the front line, and they're the ones who usually enact these policies. And they're usually the first line that tells us that we've either made a policy error or the policy is having those unintended consequences. But I think the feedback cycles that we've created, where our school-based staff and our constituents can reach out to our department directly or our board, bring those issues to light, and then we go right back into our policy process with our board and say, look, we have an issue here, here's an unintended consequence, here's how we need to change it, or here are suggestions to change it, and then we go right back into that 2-month cycle.
Right.
And so the board really walks alongside of us to make sure that we don't leave anyone behind when we write those policies, and then we make corrections along the way. Right. So they're an integral partner in this process.
So let me clear up any confusion. Does any administrator in the district have the authority to say, you know what, it's a policy, I don't agree, I don't agree with it, or do we have the authority to set aside board policies?
So That is a very nuanced question, Dr. Looney. So I'm going to answer this a couple different ways. So the wording of policy is very important. One of the things that we've tried to do in our policy manual is get very clear about the language that we use. There's a big difference between the word may and will. So I think those words are very important. May implies some discretion. Will is a directive. So if there's very clear terminology, will, must, shall, those are areas that our employees should follow to the letter. If there's discretionary language, or we even specify and says this area of policy allows for discretion, then discretion can be administered. The only other way that any school-based staff or any district employee can set aside policy is through our value-added flexibility process, where we actually apply for waivers to either state law or our local policies. But that is a very defined process that all schools have to follow. And those waivers also go through our Board of Education. So before any waivers can be enacted, that does have to go through school governance councils and our Board of Education.
So I'm going to ask you about some very specific policy
Yes,
changes
sir.
that have recently occurred. But before I do that, what if there just isn't a policy? What if the board is silent on something, whatever it might be? Then what rules for parents, for students, for employees, if there's not a policy?
Well, Dr. Looney, I'm going to quote you here. We always go through the 3 Ps, right? So is there a policy? If there's not a policy, is there a procedure? If there's not a procedure, what are the best practices? And so we encourage all of our employees to really use those 3 Ps as they make decisions. Our board policy manual is open to the public. It's on our Fulton County website. It's a great place to start. If you don't see anything in our policies, our procedures, or our operating guidelines, reach out to a friend. Figure out what is the current practice that we're using across schools, across levels, across departments, so that you can engage in that collaborative process to make a decision. I think that's really important.
So if we have a parent, a student, an employee that wants to know about the rules of operation of the district, this is what we do.
That's right.
Then is there a place, is there a resource they can utilize to say, what is the rule for X?
Yes, sir. And Board Docs is actually our housing place for all of our board policies. It also houses all of our operating guidelines. So in the operating guidelines move into a different space. That's where really the superintendent and or designees spell out how to interpret and enact the policies at the ground level, so usually in our schools. All of that, again, is on Board Docs and publicly available. So fultonschools.org/strategy and governance, and we have a whole policy page where you can see everything and access the policies quickly.
Okay, so policy at the school district level is legislation.
Yes,
It's the legislation approved by our legislative body, the school board.
that's right.
And then we issue operating guidelines and rules and regulations that interpret the policy, and it gives guidance on how we're going to implement. And so if the board or if the public or if an employee says, I think you got that wrong. I've read the policy. I'm not sure that your rules and regulations, your guidance is a correct interpretation of the board's policy. Then what?
I think there's a few different avenues, Dr. Looney. I think one is always following our chain of command, right? So starting with either your teacher or moving up to your school principal. Our school principals have direct lines of communication with our department to let us know if there's policy concerns. You can also reach our department directly. The strategy and governance department and that website have direct contact emails if there's any policies that people have concerns about. Because our board is also our legislative body, their community meetings, our board meetings are also ways for our community to come and provide input on our policies or any issues related to our policies. So they're another great resource to ask questions, because our board does a great job of communicating policy issues to me as well, and to you.
Right.
Which leads to either revisions or, here's how we need to ratify this issue at the school level, or even determine, is this just a misinterpretation of the policy as it's written? So I think the greatest thing that people can do is communicate and follow that chain of command to let us know what the issues are.
So policy the result of the legislative process at
That's
the local
right.
school district level. So let's get down in the weeds.
Okay.
What are some of the major policy shifts that the board has now ratified and our employees in the district, our students, our parents will be bound by?
Yes, sir. So over the last 3 years, grading and reporting has been the biggest policy shift. So we started a conversation with our principals and district leaders on how could we more closely align our policy to our standards mastery framework. And then we got hit by COVID-19, and that led to a lot of really research and analysis of what was happening with our policy manual. And we saw that certain students weren't being served by our policy around grading and reporting. And so we went through a very intensive process with our board to establish very clear commitments about what we expect with grading, and really did a full policy revamp. And that policy goes into effect this fall. Our teachers have already started professional learning on that policy. And so everyone can expect that grading and reporting will look very different this year and in the future years in Fulton County schools.
So more standardized, more formalized, more frequent reporting to parents and students to make sure that an A is generally an A, that third grade math A's reflect students' mastery of third grade math standards.
I couldn't have said it better, Dr. Looney. I think the other piece is that standardization word is so important. How often are students receiving feedback? How are their grades being weighted? How can they recover on assignments? What is our policy on zeros and homework? These were all things that were left up to discretion in our old policy. And by standardizing, we believe that we're really leveling the playing field for our students and providing greater communication to our parents.
So we know that the grading policy was 3 years in the making.
Mm-hmm.
It's finally done. The ink is signed. It's being implemented. What's on the horizon? What's looking forward? What are the big policy 1 or 2 issues that you think we're going to be tackling here in the current school year?
Yep, really good point, Dr. Looney. I think one area that we're focusing on is around our enrollment options. So that's another one that's been in the queue for about a year. As we think about students attending their home school, what are ways that they can attend schools other than their home school? So whether that being because their family's moved, because their parent is an employee of Fulton County Schools, or because there's different curriculum options at schools. So we're in the weeds right now in discovering that policy. The other big area that we're focused on in the future is personnel. Our personnel side of our policy manual hasn't been revised in several years, and so a lot of those policies need more clarity. So we're going to go through a very intensive yet methodical process with our board over the next year to unpack that personnel section to make sure that our policies represent best practices for our employees in Fulton County Schools.
Absolutely. I think it's very beneficial when our students, our families, our employees know what the rules of the road are. It's easier to follow the rules if we have clear rules and clear directions. So thank you for that. I want to turn my attention to something else just for a
Yes,
few
sir.
minutes. Policy whispering is not the only work that you do. You also are in charge of program evaluation.
That's correct.
What is that? And what does that entail? And just give us a brief overview of the program evaluation process.
Yes, sir. So this is another area where I have to give a shout out to our Board of Education. We don't just sign off on programs and assign resources without the desire to really make sure that those programs are working. So our program evaluation team works either internally or with third parties to dive deep into all of our programs in Fulton County Schools. Academic programs, employee programs, operational programs, to really unpack what do those programs need, how are they being implemented, and are they impactful? And so every year we go through a process of setting our agenda. So we work with all the different district departments and our schools to make sure we have a detailed list of all the programs that are in use in Fulton County Schools. And then we set off and get to work and really diving into the data and providing reports to the board on a monthly basis about how our programs are working. And that really helps us decide, is this a program that we're going to expand? Is this a program that we're going to stop using? Or do we have a program gap? Is there a problem out there that our programs are not helping us solve? And so, it's a really intensive way for us to look at our data and make strategic decisions for the district.
So in some ways, it's evaluating the return on investment.
That's right.
Novel idea in the public sector. I look forward to continuing our conversation. There's a lot to dig into.
Yes, sir.
We don't have enough time today, but I look forward to you coming back. Thank you so much, folks, for joining into Let's Talk Schools, all about policy and program evaluation with our very own policy whisperer, Dr. Ryan Moore. And now, let's go around the district in 90 seconds. That's it for our show this week. Let's keep the conversation going. We'd love to hear from you on our social media platforms. Join us next time on Let's Talk Schools. Thank you for watching.